Something the size of a modern elephant is rearing up on its hind legs, tail braced against the ground for balance, front claws, each nearly 7 inches long, hooked into the high branches of a tree. It weighs close to 4 tons. It is not a myth or a monster from folklore. It is Megatherium americanum, one of at least 19 distinct genera of giant ground sloths that once ranged from Alaska to the southern tip of South America. Some, like Megatherium and the closely related Eremotherium, rivaled elephants in size. Others, like Megalonyx jeffersoni, were closer to a bison, roughly 10 feet long and weighing over a metric ton. Still others were small, island-bound species found only in the Caribbean, no larger than a large dog. For millions of years, animals across this size range were among the dominant land mammals of the Americas. For over a century, the explanation sat unchallenged. The world warmed, the ice age ended, and the giants that depended on that cold, stable world could not survive the transition. It was a clean story. It was also incomplete. Two discoveries, one from the genomes of the sloths themselves, one from a set of footprints preserved in a New Mexico desert, have now rewritten both what happened to these animals and who was actually responsible. Megatherium itself holds a particular place in the history of science. When the French naturalist Georges Cuvier examined fossil remains recovered from Argentina in the late 1700s, he became the first person to establish, using comparative anatomy alone, that the bones belonged to an entirely extinct giant sloth rather than a living animal. His paper, published in 1796, made Megatherium americanum the first fossil mammal ever formally assigned both a genus and species name, at a time when most naturalists were still reluctant to accept that entire species could vanish from the Earth. 2 centuries later, the same animal that helped convince science extinction was real would help reveal, through methods Cuvier could never have imagined, exactly how that extinction happened. Giant ground sloths were not a single kind of creature. They were an entire radiation, wildly different in size and range. Megatherium, the largest, stood roughly 12 to 13 feet tall when reared up and weighed as much as 8,000 pounds. Megalonyx jeffersoni, first described from fossil claws sent to Thomas Jefferson in the 1790s, was smaller but still formidable. Nothrotheriops, the Shasta ground sloth, was smaller still, adapted to the deserts of the American Southwest. Scattered across the Caribbean were entirely separate, much smaller sloth species found nowhere else. For most of the 20th century, paleontologists organized this diversity by comparing the shape of bones and teeth alone. Based on that anatomy, the assumption was straightforward. One ancestral lineage split into the small, tree-dwelling sloths we still have today, and the much larger ground-dwelling sloths that eventually died out. 2 branches, cleanly separated, one surviving, one extinct. If you're finding this interesting, be sure to subscribe to understand more DNA from the past. In 2019, that assumption was tested directly against genetic evidence for the first time, and it did not survive contact with the results. 2 independent research teams publishing simultaneously, one using ancient mitochondrial DNA extracted from 10 extinct sloth species, the other using ancient collagen protein sequences pulled from fossil bone, reconstructed the sloth family tree using actual molecular data instead of bone shape alone. Both methods, working independently, arrived at the same answer, overturning more than a century of classification. The 2 living sloth lineages are not a single ancient branch that split off before the ground sloths diversified. They are not even each other's closest relatives. The 2-fingered sloths alive today are most closely related to Mylodon, an extinct ground sloth from Patagonia known as Darwin's ground sloth. The 3-fingered sloths alive today are most closely related to a separate cluster including the extinct Megalonyx and Nothrotheriops. Each living lineage is nested inside its own completely separate radiation of extinct ground sloths. Tree-dwelling sloths did not evolve once. They evolved twice, independently from two different groups of ground-dwelling ancestors, arriving at a similar arboreal body plan through convergent evolution rather than shared ancestry. The genetic material behind this discovery came from remarkable sources. In a Patagonian cave called Ultima Esperanza, researchers recovered a Mylodon darwini bone so well preserved that its genetic content allowed scientists to assemble a complete mitochondrial genome through direct shotgun sequencing. In Gypsum Cave, Nevada, paleontologists had, decades earlier, recovered dried dung from Nothrotheriops shastensis, so well preserved by the desert air that researchers eventually extracted not only the animal's own genetic material, but fragments of the plants it had eaten in its final days. This level of preservation is exceptionally rare. Most fossil material retains no genetic information at all, and finding it in different sloth lineages on two separate continents is what allowed two independent methods to arrive at the same overturned family tree with genuine confidence. What this means is that the 6 sloth species alive in Central and South American forests today are not a preserved remnant of one ancient lineage that quietly avoided extinction. They are the last 2 survivors, drawn from 2 entirely different branches, out of a much larger, more diverse family that mostly died out. The genetic data did not just correct a classification error, it reframed the entire story. This was a mass extinction that swept through nearly every branch of the sloth family tree at almost the same time, sparing only 2 small, unrelated survivors that happened to be living in trees when it happened. That raises the obvious question the genetics alone could not answer. What actually caused an extinction that large, that fast, and that widespread? Ground sloths were not the only giants that vanished during this window. Across the same few thousand years, mammoths, mastodons, giant beavers, saber-toothed cats, and dire wolves all disappeared from the Americas too, part of what paleontologists call the late Quaternary extinction event. Ground sloths offer an unusually clean test case for figuring out why, precisely because of how many separate lineages they represented, and how widely spread those lineages were geographically, from Arctic adjacent North America down through the tropics and out onto isolated Caribbean islands no other megafauna species had ever reached. A pattern that consistent across that much geographic and evolutionary range is hard to explain with a single regional event, and far easier to explain with something that moved through the landscape over time. Something like people. The climate explanation on its own has a problem of precedent. Ground sloths were not new to climate change. As a group, they had already existed for tens of millions of years, weathering repeated glacial and interglacial cycles as ice ages came and went. A 2025 study from the University of Florida, drawing on ancient DNA, and an examination of more than 400 fossils from 17 natural history museums confirmed this directly. Previous glacial transitions, though every bit as dramatic, did not produce this kind of selective mass extinction among ground sloths. The warming at the end of the Pleistocene was not unprecedented for this lineage, and the researchers concluded that paleoclimatic change alone does not explain the rapid extinction that began roughly 15,000 years ago. A group that had survived multiple major climate transitions collapsing almost entirely during one needed a more specific explanation than the climate changed, and that explanation started arriving from an unexpected source: footprints. There is also a biological reason ground sloths were unusually exposed to a new predator, and it has nothing to do with claws or size. Like most animals in this size class, ground sloths were what biologists call case-selected. Slow to mature, slow to reproduce, built for a long life rather than a fast one. Fossil evidence from Megalonyx jeffersoni indicates a gestation period of roughly 14 months. Maturity reached around 6.5 years of age, and a single offspring produced at a time, likely with years separating births. One fossil site even preserved an adult alongside 2 juveniles of different ages, suggesting extended parental care. That reproductive strategy works well against pressures the species has faced for millions of years because the population math assumes low, steady mortality. It fails badly against a new pressure capable of removing adults faster than the population can replace them. Small, fast-breeding mammals could recalibrate within a few generations. A giant ground sloth population could not. None of this means climate played no role, and most researchers today avoid framing it as a strict either-or. The most widely supported model treats climate change as a stressor rather than the sole killer. As the Ice Age ended, warming fragmented the grasslands and woodlands ground sloths depended on, shrinking their range and reducing the total number of animals the landscape could support. A population already under that pressure has far less capacity to absorb additional mortality from a new predator than a large, stable one would. Humans didn't need to hunt ground sloths to the brink alone. They needed only to add sustained pressure on top of a population climate change had already weakened, in a species whose slow reproduction meant it could not recover from either pressure quickly, let alone both at once. That combination is what most current research points toward. In 2018, researchers excavating at White Sands National Park in New Mexico published findings from a fossilized trackway, unlike anything previously documented for this species. Human footprints were found directly inside the footprints left by a giant ground sloth, not simply nearby but inside them, meaning a person had deliberately matched their stride to step precisely where the sloth had stepped. The sloth tracks showed something researchers termed flailing circles, scuffed, overlapping patterns consistent with an animal rearing up and using its claws defensively, exactly the evasive behavior expected from an animal being actively harassed or stalked. Relative dating placed the trackway at approximately 11,700 years old or older, squarely within the extinction window. It was among the first direct physical evidence that humans and giant ground sloths did not simply coexist. They interacted, and the interaction looked like predation. Subscribe to not miss the next one. The footprints were not an isolated case. At Campo Laborde in the Pampas region of Argentina, researchers identified a kill site dated to approximately 12,600 years ago, where a single Megatherium americanum had been slaughtered and butchered at the edge of a swamp, with stone tools recovered including a fragment of a projectile point. It remains the only confirmed giant ground sloth kill site in the Americas, but a second probable site, Arroyo Seco II, also in the Pampas, produced Megatherium remains alongside human-made stone artifacts dated to between roughly 14,800 and 11,000 years ago. Individual Megatherium bones elsewhere, including an ulna and a neck vertebra, bear cut marks consistent with butchery. None of this proved that hunting alone drove the extinction, but it firmly established that humans were actively pursuing, killing, and processing these animals in the same narrow window during which the species disappeared. The evidence that turned this from a plausible contributing factor into the central explanation came from a 2005 study comparing extinction timing across continents and islands. Researchers compiled radiocarbon dates from ground sloth remains across North America, South America, and the Caribbean, and the pattern was difficult to explain through climate change alone. On the continents, ground sloths went extinct by roughly 11,000 years ago, consistent with the broader collapse of megafauna across the Americas. But on Caribbean islands including Cuba, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico, an entirely separate radiation of smaller ground sloth species, genera found nowhere else, including Megalochnus, Neochnus, Acratochnus, and Parochnus, survived for thousands of years longer, having reached the islands tens of millions of years earlier and evolved in isolation with no large predators at all. Radiocarbon dating on remains from Cuba places the youngest confirmed specimens at approximately 4,200 years ago. Archaeological evidence places the first human arrival in the Greater Antilles at approximately 4,400 years ago. The last island ground sloths disappeared within roughly 200 years of that arrival. If a single global climate shift were the primary driver, there is no clear mechanism for why island sloths would have persisted 5 to 6,000 years after their mainland relatives vanished under the exact same warming trend, only to disappear within a couple of centuries of people actually reaching their islands. Extinction did not happen everywhere at once when the ice sheets retreated. It happened region by region, island by island, tracking the spread of human populations across thousands of miles and thousands of years far more closely than it tracked any single climate event. Put together, the genetic and archaeological findings tell a story that neither one could tell alone. The DNA revealed that the giant sloths were never a single group slowly fading into a handful of tree-dwelling descendants. They were a vast, diverse radiation extending across 2 continents and the islands between them collapsing almost entirely within a geologically brief window, leaving behind only 2 unrelated survivors that happened to already live in trees. The footprints, the kill sites, the reproductive biology, and the island-by-island timing of extinction reveal why that collapse happened when and where it did. Climate change reshaped the environment these animals depended on, but it does not explain why populations protected by thousands of miles of ocean survived for millennia longer than their mainland relatives, or why a slow reproducing giant with almost no natural predators before humans arrived would suddenly collapse during a warming trend it had already survived many times before. Human arrival does explain it. The giant ground sloths did not fade out with the Ice Age. They were hunted out, region by region, for as long as it took people to reach them, and the last of them, tucked away on a handful of Caribbean islands, held on for another 5,000 years simply because it took that long for anyone to find them. What remains today is a strange kind of inheritance. Every sloth alive in a rainforest canopy right now is, in a very literal genetic sense, one of 2 lucky branches that happened to be out of reach when the rest of an enormous continent-spanning family was hunted into non-existence. Cuvier looked at a handful of fossil bones in 1796 and proved that extinction was real. 2 centuries later, DNA extracted from a cave in Patagonia and dried dung preserved in a Nevada desert proved something Cuvier never could have: exactly how and at whose hands that particular extinction happened.